Welcome, NuMinds Nation, to another edition of the NuMinds podcast. Man, our guest list keeps getting more and more powerful and profound with thought leaders, creators, and really movement makers. And today is a perfect example of that. My guest today is Marc Smolowitz. He is a award-winning independent filmmaker based in San Francisco. He's got decades of experience in the film and media business. He's been significantly involved in over 50 successful independent films. It seems like he's done a little bit of everything inside the film business. His credits include screenings at prestigious festivals such as Sundance, Palm Springs, IDFA, and if you're a film buff, you'll know all these things, and you'll want to check out Marc's bio on the website, which is right under his image right there, thegwordfilm.com. He's also the founder of a company called 13th Gen. They work with a dynamic range of independent film partners all over the world and have several concurrent projects happening. Marc, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you, Ben. Right back at you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, and so our primary topic today is your newest project, and I'm assuming been put a little bit on hold due to the pandemic. I can let you talk a little bit more about that, but the title of the film is The G Word, and I guess to kind of start this off, can you talk a little bit about, you're an established independent filmmaker. I know there are many topics out there. You seem to center around social justice issues. And you made this a major project tackling the G word. So will you, first of all, maybe unpack G word for listeners and then say, why was it so compelling for you to make this your creative focus with so many things out there that you could have attacked?
These are good questions. Great way to get started. So, well, the G word stands for gifted broadly, right? And under the banner of our movie, it's a sort of deep dive into, what does giftedness really mean in the 21st century, right? We are asking a bigger question, which is who gets to be gifted in America and why in the 21st century? It's the who and the why, right? And, by way of background, when I was a kid, I was in those kind of gifted pull-out programs that were very common in public schools in the 1970s. So I tested well. My giftedness, if you will, registered as kind of leadership and certainly very well spoken. In the arts. A lot of ways that sort of are very external. And so I was a natural fit for these gifted programs. And then I tested very, very well. I was probably off the charts, kind of in language arts. To some extent in sciences, but music, art, creative, that was my sort of sweet spot. And I know that I benefited greatly from those programs as a kid, being pulled out twice a week with other smart kids to sort of, be in a room with, young kids who were at the same level. And at the time, I don't think I really thought about it all that much. It just seemed like it was the appropriate thing, right? I was being met where I was by my school. Flash forward, many years, I'm an adult, I'm making movies. And a gentleman named Ron Torriello, who had been a major donor on an earlier film, which had nothing to do with giftedness, wrote me an email, unsolicited, and sort of was telegraphing a situation in the private school where his kids, were students in elementary school. It was a private gifted school called Helios. And there's a long version of that story that I won't get into today, but, that email was in 2012. In the fall of 2014, it took a couple of years, but we decided to make the movie together. And we started filming at that exact school, Helios. And what was going on at Helios was that you had kids who were largely white, or Asian or South Asian, growing up in Silicon Valley in very affluent families, right? And still, even with all those resources, all that access, these children were having a kind of social, emotional challenges that were obvious to the parents. And that's why they were being sort of put into these school environments to get added support and to sort of, be in environments where they could be challenged, but also get that additional support. And we started filming there. I kind of fell in love with the kids. It's a great learning environment. There were a couple of interesting story beats that were emerging at Helios. But being the social justice guy, right, the guy that you described in the opening, I kept asking myself, like, what's up here? Like, why are these rich kids, quote unquote, having challenges, right? And what if you took out the resources, right? What does it look like for the not so rich kids, right? I was immediately interested in what happens when there are no resources. I mean, thank goodness I was in this beautiful school in Sunnyvale, California, where great stuff was happening for kids. And that is beautiful and valid and wonderful that those families can afford that. But I was interested in what happens when there aren't resources, right? And so that was the journey that I began, okay, as a storyteller, and gradually landed on this inquiry. And Ron endorsed that journey, right? So I started looking for stories that were not typical, right? That was sort of the beginning interest, the beginning impulse was, I don't want to tell the story that everybody knows. I want to tell the story that is, where I've discovered something, right? I want to go on a journey. When I land on something, it's because I'm curious. And certainly that childhood experience being in those gifted programs was a huge reason why I was curious, okay? I remembered what it was like. I also remembered what it was like to be a gay kid in those programs, okay? Remember, I described myself as being very outspoken, very well-spoken, leadership skills. I was super confident, even though I was a gay kid, right? And that was always very apparent. And fortunately, even though I had my moments of, feeling targeted and being, experiencing stigma, I was very popular. I was one of those kids that was very popular. I was good at theater, blah, blah, blah. And I saw all those smart kids being bullied for being smart. And I had great empathy for them. And there was just this sense of they were other, and I understood that. And I saw their otherness in myself, knowing that I was probably going to go up and be gay. I didn't know what that was at 7 years old or 8 years old, but I felt that difference very early on. I could sort of almost name it without having the word to name it. And I took that sense of social justice for other kids into my heart and into my life. And that became a real sort of ongoing trope all through growing up into young adulthood when I actually became an activist. When I finally came out as a gay person later in life, and that happened at the time in the early years of the AIDS crisis, I was quickly politicized to become that person. With this particular movie, I actually had an experience with a child at Helios that sort of made sense to me, that confirmed that I was the right filmmaker to make this movie, okay? So we had spent a weekend filming at Helios, and this beautiful girl, I'm still very friendly, her parents are dear friends, and they're major donors to this movie. This beautiful little girl who was probably 6 years old at the time, she comes up to me at the end of the day, and she gives me this big hug, like a beautiful kid, and she's like, "Mark, you're so great. I've had such a great time filming, blah, 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 blah. You must have a really beautiful, great wife at home." So she handed me an opportunity to come out to her, right? Yeah. So I, "Sweetheart, I don't have a beautiful wife at home, but I have a very handsome husband. I'm married to a man, and I'm gay." And right then, something happened in her brain that I just saw went off like, like when with these gifted kids, who have a real deep sense of things very, very early on. And she rattles off the most sophisticated, everything. I mean, the next few sentences that come out of her mind are not sentences that you would expect to come out of her mouth, out of the mouth of a 6-year-old. Okay. In fact, she was her way of talking about her understanding of what I had just shared with her was, on par with people in their early 20s. Okay. Yeah. So I thought, aha, you're the child that I'm seeing in myself. You're the child that I want to support, that I want to, make a movie about you. And you exist in every demographic. The child with a huge heart that understands that diversity is good and that doesn't matter what your identity is, that you know how to love. That's a movie worth making, right? Yeah. So that particular interaction with that child, suddenly was like, I can find these kids everywhere. They must be everywhere, right? So Flash forward all these years later, here it is 6 years later, and for the record, I have not spent 6 years making just this movie. I've made probably like 30 movies in the last 6 years. And I wear, like you say, a lot of hats when I'm making movies. And this is one, though, where I'm both the director and the producer, right? So this has to come out of some kind of part of my soul. When I'm directing, I really have to know, what film I want to make. And it probably took until 2016 to really figure that out. It took a little longer even to kind of identify all the stories that we wanted to sort of share with the public. And now we're in post-production. And we have 7 beautiful stories, and many more experts and ideas than I'll ever be able to fit into one movie. But I think I've sat with more than 40 incredible people from not just the gifted community, but thought leaders, people in lots of different fields, brain science, neuroscience, lots of amazing people to help us unpack sort of gifted and talented education, in general, under the guise of this question. Who gets to be gifted in America and why in the 21st century? So in the G word, we will take you to places and spaces across this great nation where you don't expect to encounter giftedness, where you don't think you're going to encounter smart people. And we're going to take you there, and we're going to show you not only that they're there, but they're not just white, they're not just men, and they're not just cisgender. Okay? So this is a diverse century. This is a neurodiverse century. So we've really embraced that. And I've got stories at the border with Mexico. I've got a story inside a men's prison. I've got a story on a Native American reservation. I've got a story in inner city Baltimore. I've got stories in places and spaces where you just don't expect to encounter smart kids, right?
Yeah.
So we've really embraced the idea that giftedness is local. It's everywhere. It's rural, suburban, and urban. We have a great story in suburban America, 25 miles north of Seattle. I actually am really interested in suburban America because I think suburban America is where diversity is really happening. Certain political forces think that, suburbia looks a certain way. And the truth is that the suburban county where our story is set, there are 94 languages spoken at home. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the suburbia that I'm encountering when I make this movie. And that's pretty similar in states everywhere. So we chose these 7 stories because we feel they will offer our audience a beautiful journey and a sort of unexpected, immersive sense of place. You land in these people's lives, in these towns, in these zip codes. That's a huge theme for the movie, a zip code. And understand that, education is a social contract that is the right of every American, right? And just to zoom out a little bit, people may think that gifted and talented education is very specific, right? But it actually is a sort of a way into very big picture issues in the education system. And the deeper I've gone, the more and more that's been confirmed. And the part of that has to do with that you have smart kids in every kind of school system who may or may not be being served, whether it's a home school, a micro school, an innovation school, a private school, a public school, on and on and on, right? And they're facing the same challenges everywhere, right? Throw in neurodiversity, or what we in the movie refer to as twice exceptionality or thrice exceptionality, 2E and 3E, and all bets are off because there are very little sort of things in place to serve these children. Scott Barry Kaufman, who's one of the interviewees in the movie, who's also become a good friend, he talks about in an interview I did with him in 2017 that there are likely 300,000 to 500,000 students who fit the profile of twice exceptional in our nation's schools.
Wow.
Okay? And when you put that kind of number on it, if he's right, and I suspect he is, that's a huge number of students. Okay, you start to distribute that across 50 states, across all the municipalities in those 50 states. There are twice exceptional kids everywhere. Okay, they live among us. Okay, yeah. And I say that sort of tongue in cheek because that's actually how I'm treating them in the movie. Is your neighbors are neurodiverse. The kids in your kids' classroom are neurodiverse, more likely than not becoming increasingly more visible as neurodiverse people. The twice exceptional piece is huge for this movie. I discovered 2E in 2015. I hadn't even heard the idea before. As I was interested in this kind of who gets to be gifted in America and why, and landed on this concept of twice exceptionality, and it just kind of hit me in the face. That this is the idea that you could be gifted, but also have a learning disability of some other kind that would then mask your intelligence and make you present as if you belong in special ed, and how crushing that could be for a child.
And that's right? That's where the school system puts all the energy and emphasis is on the disability, is on the challenge.
So our movie really dives into that part of the story, right? Strengths versus deficits, and being a culture that is so focused on deficits, exactly, right? Yeah. Now, the interesting part about twice exceptionality, and this may be something that your listeners or viewers actually also think about, is 2E is actually the thing which has helped get gifted on the table again in a really legitimate way, because it is focused on deficits, oddly enough. Like, we can sort of complain about the focus on deficits, but it's deficits that are the thing that has gotten neurodiversity into the IEP process, right? So because of deficits, suddenly giftedness is in the conversation again, right? So I think, there are a lot of really interesting outcomes at the local level where you see different school districts understanding that to different and varying degrees. Anyway, that was a very long way of answering your question, but it's been no small undertaking. We've really been active on this one for 6 years. I needed to figure out what movie I wanted to make. These are communities that have been not well represented, or often very fairly represented. Really, journalists and other storytellers, really leaning into stereotypes or misinformation about what's really going on. There's, all these kind of, people calling gifted this elitist or racist. I can go on and on about all these different things, but it's, I just wanted to make a movie that was really focused on the sort of human stories, because the kids and the families and the adults that I was uncovering, they looked like diverse America to me.
And yeah, absolutely. I love, not to get too academic, but I love that how at a meta level, you're like the perfect embodiment of why we need to nurture those gifts and meet those kids exactly where they are. Like in your case, it sounds like you had the EQ and the social skills to sort of navigate this territory on your own. Like you said, you came from a particular background where your skills were highlighted as part of the identification process. So you had the opportunity, but we know that, these overexcitabilities that tend to exist in gifted minds, such as heightened empathy, heightened sense of social justice, things like that, which you seem to embody. That empathy is kind of what allows you to see into the hearts of these other populations that you even back then seemed to notice were underrepresented. So I just want to say for the record, what a beautiful film to be made to bring this deeply human side to the gifted story. I mean, I say this as a gifted person myself who's gone through a lot of inner turmoil during the process, and then as a gifted teacher. And actually, I have a very, very personal, poignant connection to the story in general, and also to a specific story that I know you highlight. So for a quick little background, before I was an entrepreneur, I was a teacher. I was a teacher of the gifted and talented. But before that, I was alternatively certified. I came straight from the corporate world into education. And my very first teaching assignment was 4th grade bilingual at a Title I campus, okay? Because I'm bilingual, and they need, elementary bilingual was in very high demand at the time. So here's my first day on campus. I'm setting up my room, Mark. Listen to this. A teacher walks up to the room, very friendly, very nice, very professional, asked me, "Hey, you must be the new teacher. What's your name and what do you teach?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Ben. I'm Mr. Cook. I'm the new 4th grade bilingual teacher." And she was, "Oh, okay. Well, you'll never see me because I'm the gifted and talented teacher, but nice to meet you." And even back then, my first day on campus, I knew there was something really, really wrong, really awry with that attitude. And it planted a seed in me from the very beginning of this disconnect. I wasn't quite ready to be a rebel yet, so I just kind of went with it. But over the years, that became one of my missions as a teacher, was to shatter this idea of giftedness only being a certain thing in a certain population, and that it's represented everywhere and it manifests differently and it's beautiful everywhere that it shows up. And when I watched the vignette, and I highly recommend everyone go thegwordfilm.com. You have 6 little kind of, you call them vignettes or snippets?
And actually, so they're actually short films, right? So what I do when I'm directing, especially, is I make short films while I'm making a movie. It's vitally important for me that I do that because it helps me figure out my visual style, who are the characters, what's the pacing, what's the tone. If I am entirely heads down while I'm making a movie like this, which is such a large and significant project, that wouldn't serve the project, right?
Yeah.
Plus, we get to engage with our partners, our funders, our audience, the press, and really create engagement and awareness while the film is being made. And some of these videos that are available on our website, they get published on Facebook and they get published on Vimeo. And they're not, I say they're short films, they're not super short. They range from like 7 minutes to 14 minutes. So you really do get a pretty nice story when you sort of sit with these shorts. Some of these have been viewed 40,000 or more times and shared literally, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And so each time we release one, granted, we have, we have an enterprise behind this movie. So, we release them with some energy and some strategy, but that I'm always completely blown away by the reach of these videos and how relevant the response is and how universally well responded are. They're so well responded to everywhere.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the video that is set in San Luis, right?
Yeah, exactly. They were all powerful, and I connected to each of them in their own way. But that one in particular, because of my personal narrative, I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about the experience filming there. Tell them a little bit about this small town in Arizona. I think it's cited as the second most, economically disadvantaged area in Arizona, and yet they are producing at a level that exceeds statistical probability, high achieving, academically minded students. And it's in this, Mexican American community which is normally extremely underrepresented in the gifted world. Can you talk a little bit about that particular story?
Yes, of course. So, as I was looking for stories, and sort of getting to know the gifted and talented landscape, all the big institutions that serve gifted and talented kids, I encountered sort of the talent development centers. So there's a slate of some 9 of them around the country. They're connected with major large research universities. And I made a very warm connection with the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Okay. And at the time, the executive director, her name was Elaine Hansen, and she's no longer with the organization, but she and I were sort of hitting it off on email on Zoom. And even back then I was using Zoom. And she happened to be coming to the Bay Area, or largely to Northern California, to UC Santa Cruz, which was one of the summer satellite locations for their summer camps for advanced learners. And I had been to Baltimore, I had shopped there, and I'd met with them all in person, and sort of had started these conversations over time. And so Elaine kind of knew what I was looking for. She knew I wanted to unearth stories that hadn't been told before, and that was sort of the guiding principle of the G word. And so I happened to go to UC Santa Cruz. That's where I did my undergraduate. So my producer, Tim, and I, we hop in my car, we drive down the coast from San Francisco. It's 70 miles away. And we're like, let's go spend the day at UC Santa Cruz and see what CTY does and, why so many students from around the world want to participate. Well, Elaine orchestrated a beautiful day getting to know the program. And part of the day was a lunch with a bunch of different, young people. And it was very curated by her. You could just feel it. And several of those students in that particular cohort I'm still in touch with, but one was a young gentleman, maybe in his early 20s, who had grown up in San Luis. Okay. And, as we go around the table, they're all introducing themselves, telling me who they are, telling us a little bit about their background. And he's telling me about, growing up at the border. And, just the whole thing was like, whoa, what is this? This is a really interesting story. And so long story short, I got his email, we got to know him, and I unpacked the whole story, right, with his help. And it became sort of connected to a particular gentleman named Omero, who's the guidance counselor in that school district. He's, the guy who sort of has been one of the people leading the charge to kind of create the successful story of these kids in San Luis. So this didn't happen overnight. It's been more than 20 years in the making. Mm-hmm. And so that community sends more children to the CTY summer camps around the nation than any other comparable zip code. And in fact, they compete with all of the most affluent Caucasian zip codes in the nation around this CTY offering every year. They are consistently in the top 10 in the world. And so that was really interesting to me that was happening. And not because they had any official gifted and talented program within the school district, but rather this was something that was sort of a set of programs and principles that were guiding every school at every level, right? And it was public, and it was at the border. And, it's during the Trump era when border politics were pretty hot, right? So there were so many reasons for me to want to go down there and investigate, right? So we wound up shooting down there twice. And the first time was in the heat of summer. It was about 120 degrees. And what do you think is happening in San Luis in the heat of summer? All these young children are going to rigorous academic summer school and academic summer camps because guess what? It's air conditioned, right? So whereas most kids are like, outside, trying to, play sports, these kids are like learning chemistry, right? And learning algebra and, doing stuff with science and doing stuff with writing and music. The music piece was key, okay? So what I've found in low-income communities, and San Luis, case in point, and also this story up in northern Minnesota at the Native American reservation, is that so often it's arts and culture, or music and art, that are the pathway into other opportunities for these low-income students. Okay? And so the San Luis School District has done an incredible job of investing in music as a way of investing in their kids' self-empowerment, right? And so I really leaned into this part of the story because what I was starting to understand deeply is that if you don't see yourself as smart, you're never going to walk through this world as someone who's smart, right? We live in a country where basically if you're black or brown or different, right, you're not represented as smart. You don't get those kinds of messages from the mainstream media, or often from the government, or often from, your local community, right? And so if you sort of recalibrate the student experience to focus on the four selves, which I call self-worth, self-esteem, self-agency, and self-efficacy, if you have all four, you're actually going to be empowered, right? Then you are on your way to becoming a sort of, a student who has some sense of where I'm going. Right. Mm-hmm. And in so many instances, it's music and art and culture that have been the way for these kids to find that. Right. We filmed with, there was a story beat I was exploring with a young gifted Black girl here in Oakland, California, where I live in San Francisco. It's across the bay. And she's a 12-year-old. She's probably 15 now, but she was starting her own baking business. And I love that this young Black girl was, an entrepreneur and she had been on one of these Genius Kid shows, and that's how she kind of got referred to me. And we can bookmark the Genius Kid shows over here for a second, but they're sort of there, and they do what they do. And we filmed an event, which was like a launch event for her. And you have this chorus there of African-American young people singing beautifully, and they're wearing T-shirts that say "Young, Black, Gifted." And I just thought, well, that says a lot, doesn't it, right? Like the choir puts the T-shirt on, right? So I do a little research, and this idea of choirs that are young and Black and gifted, it's actually a thing, and it's everywhere, right? And it's a thing that, it sort of riffs on a famous Nina Simone song, "Young, Gifted, and Black," right? But it's a way for these kids to, you put a shirt on, you wear it on your chest, you walk through the streets of Oakland to the next event. You're young, you're Black, and you're gifted, right? Yeah. And you see yourself on a trajectory that has to do with potential, right? Now, and I share this with you because this movie believes, okay, that yes, there are innately smart people. in this world. There just are, okay? There are just geniuses out there, okay? And, they're going to be off the charts regardless, of who they are or where they've grown up. And that's apparent. But this movie believes that there are even more that are not being discovered or encouraged, okay? And that is a huge loss to our society. Yeah. And those are the children and teens and young people that I am interested in supporting further to be on a trajectory of success. And it's, if you can't see yourself as smart, if you've never been told that you can be smart, how the frick are you going to be smart, right? If your version of smart is you acting out in class because you're not challenged and you're a black male and that's like detention for you, we know what that looks like, right? So, this movie seeks to kind of upend all of our assumptions of who gets to be smart and why in this country. And if we uncover the idea that there's black and brown genius out there, or queer and trans genius, dare I be so bold, which we have in our movie as well, that's probably something important for the country's overall economic vitality.
Absolutely. So I love that you've kind of identified this thread, that all this exposure and experience and research that you've done, you've seen this theme of arts. Arts seems to be sort of like the fuel, that's kind of like the buoyancy for them to identify themselves as some kind of manifestation of brilliance, of smart. And I love how you stated that. And it also sounds like in the case of the border town, that the culture had been permeated with this sense of excellence, of ability, of effort that seemed to pervade. That's one of the roadblocks that I came across as an educator was, it wasn't just the traditional, old white male teachers who were the barrier that were holding on to these stereotypes. It was everyone. It was the bilingual Hispanic teachers. It was the parents. It was the students themselves who were walking around with these old structures, these old paradigms. And it sounds like, I love how you identified arts as like a key way to kind of throw off those shackles and kind of re-identify. And you also mentioned, black and brown students and unique challenges there. And that just reminds me of the mini film with Van Jones and him talking about how he looked inside prisons for intelligence and for wisdom. And a superb one-liner from the film with Van Jones in it. He says, I'm paraphrasing, I don't know if I have it exactly, but he says, I was in the jailhouse on Friday and the White House on Monday, because he wanted to go to Obama with representation. And I love how he makes this assertion that there's just as much giftedness inside prisons as out. Not only that, but the wisdom inside prisons is actually more profound than out because of that life experience. Do you want to talk at all about that particular aspect of this?
Yeah, of course. So because I live in the Bay Area, there's a lot of sort of problems here with economic inequality, right? Income inequality, right? It's become this destination place in the world. All the tech companies are here. There's an incredible rush to come here, because of that. And it has become the most expensive place to live in North America, hands down, full stop, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't poor people here, right? And that there aren't a lot of people living in poverty here who are, struggling. And that also doesn't mean that there aren't huge efforts here to support them or to try and, sort of change the dynamic, right? Maybe that's another movie entirely, right? But because of my social justice side of me and of who I am, both as a storyteller and as an activist, I was interested in, do poor kids get access to gifted programs here in the Bay Area? And so I started knocking on the doors in San Francisco and Oakland in particular, because there's such a strong Black community over in the East Bay, and started asking the question, does anyone care about gifted Black kids, right? And I got tons of pushback. I mean, that it was just, and for all kinds of reasons, right? One kind of response was, well, we don't have time to talk about gifted here because we're dealing with drugs and gangs, right? And so, when you get that kind of response, it sort of ends the conversation, right? Really troubling. And I talk mostly initially to principals that I was introduced to by friends and colleagues in the education space. But I kept hearing this phrase, detention to prison pipeline, detention to prison pipeline, detention to prison pipeline. And I mean, literally, like just doing the kind of due diligence and research that, is natural for me as a curious filmmaker, is that I'm like, well, let me start talking to the prisons and see what they have to say about it. And guess what? They had a lot to say about it. So I had some pretty interesting off-the-record conversations with some prison officials here in the Bay that really got my juices going here, right? In the gifted and talented world, there's been one official research sort of study about giftedness inside prisons, and it's dated in the mid-late 80s, so it's very old. But in no way can it be seen as current. But even then, there was a strong indication that prison populations had quite a high number of high intelligent or high ability people. And there was one really interesting article that I found that had been written a few years ago about it, but it just seemed to be like, wow, this is an opportunity to kind of sort of, get our movie sort of dealing with and undertaking some interesting storytelling that has potential to be meaningful. So I started looking out there, like, who's doing interesting work in prisons? And it was not too long and hard to find Van Jones, because he has the Dream Corps and all these interesting nonprofits that are sort of working in that space. So I was fortunate to be able to sit down and interview him. And Van Jones is sort of an example of the kind of person in this movie. He's not someone you think of in the gifted world. Like there's the traditional gifted and talented world, and that world is very well represented in this movie. And we have some of the most important, interesting experts from that world. But we have other types of experts that were important for me to showcase and include, because they're thought leaders who are also gifted themselves and who also help us sort of unpack this question, right? So when I ask Van Jones, who gets to be gifted in America and why, his idea was to respond the way he responded around prisons. And I kind of, steered him in that direction, but he painted this incredibly beautiful sort of, backstory of that makes sense for this movie. And it was actually after the sit down with Van Jones that we actually found our way into an actual prison. I looked at a number of ways to get inside, of how I wanted to film there. And there were a couple of things that were sort of taking shape through kind of programs that help gentlemen inside who are trying to start their own businesses and be entrepreneurs from inside. That was kind of interesting to me as a way in to kind of think about, well, they're not just sitting inside, not doing much. They're actually trying to build a business. Hit some roadblocks there. And then I landed on a different way into the prisons, which was really exciting for me. And it's through a social justice project that does Shakespeare plays inside California prisons. Yeah. So I spent time in Solano prison, basically documenting a group of Black and brown men, primarily doing Shakespeare and sort of their process. And here again, it was a very transformative day of filming with them. We filmed both a rehearsal and a show. I got to spend a lot of time with them, sort of asking them big questions about what it was like growing up in this country and what their school experience was like. And quite a few, you could tell, are quite gifted. Okay, so and I went in with them. They're called the Marin Shakespeare Project, and so they're from Marin County, which is north of San Francisco. And I went into the prisons with them first and really saw how they work, and got to meet with these men myself. And I saw their gifts. I was witness to their gifts, and it was quite compelling. And as much as that day was beautiful for the documentary and really transformative for myself and my team to kind of spend time with these men, I know that it also impacted them. We came in and we saw them; they were seen, right? And we gave their time, and we did some exercises on camera that I've kind of, I've done a number of settings that are very much in this kind of vein of trauma and empowerment, and thinking about how to find empowerment in the face of trauma. I mean, it doesn't get more traumatic than being incarcerated, right? And so most of these men in Solano are lifers, and so it's, they're never getting out, right? So just being a part of any kind of sort of, self-improvement programs inside the prison is really just for their quality of life while they're in prison, right? They're never going to get out.
Right.
So, so that says a lot right there, right? If they show up regularly and they want to act in a play and be a part, help design the costumes, help, execute it. It's pretty powerful stuff. And it just says a lot about when you give people opportunity, when you give people training and you give them support, they can sort of work through the trauma, right? Another piece about trauma is that, you mentioned this early, like I've made lots of movies about lots of different topics. Right, I've made movies about LGBT stuff, about HIV and AIDS, about post-traumatic stress disorder, about poverty. I mean, big health issues. And I know a little something about trauma. And that's something that I've owned, my whole life. And I've developed a whole sort of, kind of comfort with traumatic stories. And very early in making the G Word, it was clear that there are a lot of deep and dark traumatic narratives in this sort of larger milieu of giftedness. So right there, I could see my role as being an ally in getting those stories out into the world and helping people heal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know our time is starting to wind down here, but there's one more population from the film, but I would love to have you address a little bit. So I'm the parent of a gifted transgender son, and I know that you made special care to address and work on the perception of that community and their unique struggles. But can you talk a little bit about, is that one aspect of the trauma cycle? Is what are the unique challenges of the LGBTQ gifted population?
Well, so very early on, and this was sort of anecdotal, right? But I was noticing that for some reason, and those reasons we're sort of exploring in the documentary, there are a very high number of trans and gender nonconforming gifted teens and tweens in these settings. Okay. We were encountering a lot of stories, a lot of families, a lot of parents, a lot of kids that were dealing with this stuff, right? Off the charts bright, off the charts, potential, registering in all kinds of complex ways, sometimes with trauma, sometimes with neurodiversity, which registers all kinds of problems like ADHD. And, the list is long. And so that really piqued my interest because I am someone who has been an ally of the trans community for a long time. I've made other films about, with and about the trans community. I've worked with trans filmmakers. And I say this kind of jokingly. I didn't just wake up in 2015 and start thinking about trans people when Laverne Cox appeared on Time Magazine's cover. Okay. Like I've been thinking about gender in the context of the larger LGBTQ communities, pretty much my whole adult life. And I'm 51, right? So I've been thinking about your trans son for a long time, and I was encountering trans kids while making this movie, so I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't ignore that it was a trend. Like what's up with that? Why so many, right? And so, we have one set of stories that is a deep inquiry into that part of the sort of storyscape. And it's been beautiful. And I have Ilan and Church are my two trans and gender nonconforming characters. And, they will bring a lot to this movie. We'll be exploring, lots of big topics with them, which have to do with gender and identity and brain science and sort of creativity and, the brain. It's all interconnected. Interestingly, there are some very good academic studies that are unfolding that are looking at sort of why is there so much trans in autism? Why do you see such a large number of autistic, people who are also transgender? So there are some legitimate studies that are starting to happen. For the record, for your audience, that just for clarity, like I'm not saying that trans and gender nonconforming kids are smarter than anyone else, right? What I am saying is that anecdotally, as a storyteller, I noticed that there were a lot of these kids in the room. And I found that fascinating, okay? And because I am an ally of the trans community, I'm openly queer, I'm openly HIV positive, I walk the walk of this stuff and do so publicly and confidently. Parents were approaching me, right? And wanting to talk about like the whole pronoun thing, right? Yeah. And I realized that I had an opportunity, right? And what's really fascinating is that here you have me on your podcast. Thank you for including me. I'm out and proud and happy to talk to you. And if you look at all the gifted conferences, I'm starting to be a pretty, visible quotient in the gifted conferences, keynotes, panels. People want to go to my webinars. I'm the only out gay person. Okay, that I know of. Maybe there's one other. I can point to one other person. Sorry, but I'm the most out person. Okay, and many times I'm the only one on the roster. Right. This is a huge problem, right? If kids don't see queers, who are positively, representing ourselves to them, then it doesn't matter how many allies are in the room. Like, they don't have any role models, right? And so it's important, so we need to see, more trans representation in the gifted and talented conversation. We need to see more just LGBT generally in the gifted and talented conversation, because we know these kids are smart and they deserve our support. So
yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate you telling me about your son, because that's huge for a parent, right? To be able to, comfortably and confidently speak about having a trans kid or a gay kid or a queer kid or whatever. It's, that is a huge win for you, for your family, for your son, and for every other parent who might be on a journey similar to yours.
Yeah, I mean, the more the conversation is out there being had in intelligent ways like this, the easier the path is going to be.
I will say I have been targeted for this, many times in the gifted community, and it's and I say that out loud without pointing fingers, without naming names, but it is just fierce out there. If you want to be an ally of trans kids, if you want to be an ally of difference and diversity, I immediately get put into this liberal gay guy from San Francisco box where everyone, people on the center right or right just demonize me, and I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in kids doing well from all backgrounds. Okay. Yeah. And I may have a radical leftist side to who I am and how I live, so be it. Okay. We all are who we are. Right. I'll leave you with this at the end of the podcast. Okay. This movie seeks to be relevant to people of all backgrounds and all political affiliations. Okay. We want to keep more people in the room than less. Education is a public story. It's for every child. Okay.
Yes.
And, whether you believe it or not, there are trans kids in your child's classroom, and that's why the teacher's talking about it. Okay. It's unless you decide that you want your white, straight, cisgender child to just be in classrooms with other white, straight, cisgender children, then that's called white supremacy. Right? That's just not what America looks like, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, we're going to have to agree to disagree about some of this stuff if we're really going to have deep and meaningful discussions about what benefits more children than less. If you want to have that conversation, come see our movie.
Yeah, and Mark, I really think the short films speak for themselves. Like you said, it's not about politics. It's about representing humanity in all its spectrum of representation, and education is a public endeavor, and I think the short films speak for themselves. I can't wait for the full film. Is there anything you can give us in terms of timeline that? Yes.
Yeah. So before the COVID crisis hit, we were pretty much shot. The movie was pretty much done in terms of being filmed. I actually had a plan to do some pickups in Seattle where we have some stories for the movie, and those had to be canceled. That was right in the beginning of March, and it was just such a crazy time because of COVID cancellations. Anyway, long story short, we pivoted fully into post-production, and so this year is about editing the movie, and we are editing. That's what we're doing. It takes time. I think I'll know a lot more about exactly, what our real timeline is once we get to about April of next year. With 7 big stories and all these big ideas and all these different experts, we're sort of, we're hurting a lot of cats right now trying to get them into one movie. But I would venture to guess that we're going to be aiming for early 2022 world premiere. We'll sort of see how that goes. We're still fundraising, so we have a lot of money to raise. We have some interesting and creative ways that we're going to try to make that happen. And it just feels very doable. I mean, it's already October of 2020. So when I tell you January 2022, it's really just like 15 months from now. Yeah. So to your, if you can wait 15 or more months, I will, do my best to deliver something that is meaningful and powerful and will be worth your time. It'll be a movie of somewhere around 90 to 100 minutes. So it's going to be a real sit-down feature. And, it's been actually very creative editing it. And I have a wonderful team. Shout out to my wonderful team. And it's and making those short films has been so important for us to kind of feel like we know what we're doing. And we have already gone deep with this material, right? So it's, we have, something like 280 hours of footage, so it's an incredible material.
Yeah. That's, if we had more time, I would love to get into your creative process and talk more at the meta level about the act of creating something like this. But that great reason to have a second podcast down the line. For now, I'm so excited about you coming on and sharing today. I think it's a beautiful project. And everyone who wants to learn more, the gwordfilm.com, they can go out there, they can watch the short films, they can follow the timeline, they can see other announcements, and maybe even some people out there want to sponsor and help in the fundraising as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. And your organization is one of our partners. So if any of your listeners and viewers are a part of a nonprofit or other kind of association or company that is caring about gifted and talented, reach out to us and there are ways to get involved. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure chatting today. And I'm very excited about the coming months and the film.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay.